Hi, everybody. I'm Julie Wiskirchen from the authors team, and today I'm excited to welcome Mark Evanier, who's the author of the definitive biography of Jack Kirby. Mark was born in Santa Monica and started collecting comics as a boy, then became a professional comic writer and apprenticed with Jack Kirby. He has an extensive background in television writing, including variety shows, Welcome Back, Kotter, That's Incredible, and cartoons like Scooby-Doo and Dungeons & Dragons. And his recent comic book writing projects include Black Hawk, Gru the Wanderer, the animated Garfield and Friends. And he's going to talk to us today about his biography of Jack Kirby. So please join me in welcoming Mark.
Thank you. I am not only born in Santa Monica, but if you look out any east-facing window of this building, you can see the building I was born in. And my father used to work 2 blocks from here. In the worst job in the world. He worked for the Internal Revenue Service, hated the job, and he encouraged me to do anything I wanted in my life as long as I liked it doing it. And I've been fortunate enough to like what I've done the whole time. I've been very fortunate to meet a lot of fascinating people. I've been fortunate to meet a lot of the people whose work I liked as a kid. Animation people and people who did TV shows. I got to meet Dick Van Dyke. That was one of my big thrills, and work with Dawes Butler, the voice of Yogi Bear. And the most interesting person I got to work with over the years was this man named Jack Kirby, who was the most amazing talent I ever encountered in my life. I met a few people who you could apply the word genius to, but it was never more applicable than it was in the case of Jack, who had this amazing mind, which I'll try to tell you a little bit about, and I'm sure I can't describe it adequately. I met Jack in July of 1969. He had just moved to California. He was living in Irvine, California. Hello, Irvine. You're tuned into this broadcast, I understand. And I had a comic book club at the time, and our officers went down to meet Jack Kirby. Now, I kind of knew Jack as an artist before then, and as I came to discover, I wasn't the only person who felt a special connection with this man's work. I've been collecting comic books all my life, and a lot of my favorite comic books have been drawn by this man named Kirby. And there was something about Jack's work that just made it very special. Even when he was, they used to say that the test of a great movie star was that they were interesting even when they were in a bad movie. Jack was even interesting when he was drawing a dull comic book. He didn't draw very many dull comic books. When he got a stiff, he made it interesting just by the sheer virtue of his performance. And when I met Jack, I got a little indication of why this was, because he had this amazing mind and this amazing ability to inject personality and energy into everything he did. You've all met lots of smart people in your life. Some of you will maybe even be smart people. You find that a lot of smart people, their brains go from A to B to C, and then sometimes they're smart enough they jump to E. They're a little ahead of you, they get ahead of themselves, and they jump to G. Jack would start with R. He would then go back and do B. He'd never get to A at all. He would then go to W, and at some point he'd have you on beyond zebra. He would invent new things to talk about. You could talk to him about anything, not just comics. I started talking about comics, but the topics invariably drifted into other areas, and he was very well read. This fooled a lot of people because Jack had this kind of New York street manner of talking. We have this tendency to think that someone who doesn't speak perfect English is not well read or not educated. Jack was very educated. He was self-taught, but he was very educated, and he was interested in everything. He absorbed things around him, and you could talk to him for hours about comic books. You could talk to him for hours about Greek mythology. You could talk to him about politics, anything. And it was not a matter of compartmentalizing, because Jack saw the whole worldview and every topic in his life, connected with every topic in his life. One of the skills I think he brought to his work as a writer and artist was this ability to make unusual connections. They say that a great chef is just a guy who figures out a different way to put together the same stuff. All chefs have the same vegetables, the same meats, the same spices at their disposal, but they figure out different ways to put it together that no one else has. And Jack would take story elements that no one else would think to put together, and he'd invent a new comic out of it. Or he would take visual shapes or concepts of perspective that no one had ever used that way, and he would put them together and he'd get this dynamic artwork. And this has become even more apparent to me, the magic that he had since his passing. He died in 1994, and since then, there's been like this new outpouring of interest in him by a whole new generation of people who never had the chance to meet Jack. I go to comic conventions now where I go around signing this book, and people come up to me and they want to shake my hand, not because they have any interest at all in my hand, but because my hand touched Jack Kirby's hand. And that's as close as they can get today. And they feel that need to make a connection with this man whose work mattered so much to them. When Jack was alive, he was very easy to meet. If you cared enough to go to one of the big comic conventions, especially the San Diego one, and stand in line for 20 minutes or less, you could meet Jack Kirby. You could talk to him about anything you wanted. You could ask him any question, and he would give you an answer, even if he had to make something up. I once saw a kid come up to Jack and ask him, what was Captain America's shield made out of? And this was a topic that had never occurred to Jack in all the years he'd done Captain America. It was completely out of left field, and he thought, and he took it as a challenge. And right on the spot, he invented a whole story. He said, it's a meteorite. You know, the last thing you or I would think of to answer that question with. That was the kind of mind he had. And he invented this whole story. If I had taken notes, it could have been a 4-issue miniseries out of it. And he just on the spot invented a whole story about how Captain America was out hunting Nazis one day, and he found a meteorite, and he built a shield out of it, and the shield had these magnetic properties, and he invented this stuff. And this is how it all came out of him. If you took Jack an idea, as many of us did as young writers and artists, if you came to him with an idea you had for your comic or your character, he would tell you the whole plots of your first 5 issues. He would just sit there and spontaneously invent new things, and you'd sit there going, oh, my character does that? Oh, he should have that. He did this with a lot of comics. He influenced a lot of comic books that you never knew he had an influence on because writers and artists would come to him. At one time in the 50s, there was a writer named Robert Bernstein who wrote a lot of comics. He wrote a lot of stuff for DC. He wrote The Fly and for Archie and such. And he lived not far from Jack, and he was always having trouble coming up with story ideas. So what he would do, this is back in New York, is he would go down to the train station and just wait there, skipping the various trains that were heading into Manhattan. And when he saw Jack come, he'd run and get on the same train with him. And he'd sit next to Jack and he'd say, God, I need a plot for Jimmy Olsen. I got to pitch Mort Weisinger some Jimmy Olsen ideas. And Jack would say, well, how about this? And Bernstein would just scribble down ideas. And he'd go in and he'd pitch them. And suddenly Jack Kirby, without credit or money, was plotting Jimmy Olsen for the competitor. He did this with everybody around him. And I've never known a more fertile imagination in my life. He was just amazing this way. You're going to hear me use the word amazing about as many times as in the debate the other night they used the word fundamentals. It's impossible to talk about Jack without that. If you went to the San Diego convention and you met Jack, first of all, he would stand. He was about 5'6", kind of little stocky, a little tough little guy. In his youth, he was mistaken a lot for Jimmy Cagney. And if you were standing, he would stand. And one of the other things that I learned from him, which is not to say I always apply it properly, was that he treated everybody with enormous respect. Total strangers were treated like they were entitled to be in the king's presence, and he didn't stand on any kind of ceremony. He would talk to you as an equal, no matter who you were, for as long as you wanted, answer all your questions. I think he sometimes spent too much time with some people who didn't deserve it. The one thing he wouldn't do for people was he wouldn't do a sketch for them. One of the storylines of Jack's life was that he did not receive rewards, financial rewards, quite commensurate with what he gave. And it had become, by the time the conventions erupted in the 70s, and we were all going to these comic conventions, it had become a sore spot with him that he would do a drawing for a fan, and the next thing he'd see it being sold in the fanzines. Today it would be sold on eBay, but it just bothered him too much. But he would talk to you forever, and he would give you philosophical concepts, and he would tell you the story of his life, and he would especially tell you about World War II, which was one of the seminal, life-changing moments, periods of his own existence. And If you listened to the guy, you came away with enormous insight, and you felt energized. He was one of those, you hear the phrase, he was a writer who makes you feel like a writer. Jack was a creative person who made you feel like a creative person. He got his start in comics about the time comics were getting started. When he got into the business, he was a relative newcomer, having gotten in a year or two later than everyone else. But very soon he became one of the preeminent artists, if not the preeminent artist of his generation. He was team with a man named Joe Simon, who was a brilliant writer-type person, creative artist, editor, packager. They had a very strong relationship. They both wrote, they both drew, they both came up with ideas. There's an awful lot of work that they did together where they could not tell who did what. I sat with Joe Simon, Joe volunteered to sign this book at a convention in April, and we sat at this convention in New York for about 4 or 5 hours, and he signed copies of it left and right. People were much more interested in getting, as they should, in getting his signature on it than getting mine. And I kept asking him as we went through the book, he kept looking at pages, and I'd say, did you ink that, or did Jack ink that? He said, we didn't know in 1943 who did that. We couldn't remember that. We couldn't tell. The one area that you can spot the difference is that Jack was a little more prolific as an artist and a little stronger as an artist, and Joe was a little more prolific and dominant as editor, packager, deal maker. Joe was responsible for a lot of the designs of the covers, the designs of the splash pages. The first page of a comic book is called the splash page, and Simon and Kirby had the best splash pages in the business. The best lettering, the best logos, the best designs, the best composition. That was primarily Joe, and Jack learned a lot from Joe. And then Joe learned a lot about storytelling and dynamics and penciling from Jack, because Jack had this native ability to make work exciting. And Jack was one of the first guys in comics to differentiate comic books from the repasted newspaper strips that they started out as. Original comic books were somebody took a lot of old Dick Tracy strips, cut them up into a different page format, pasted them down, and that was a comic book. And the problem with that was that, first of all, the material wasn't drawn for that format, and secondly, being a repasted newspaper strip, all the panels were the same height and relatively the same shape. Characters were all contained in the panels. It was all very static compositions. And Simon and Kirby, and again, in this case, Jack was probably more dominant, were among the very first to break out and have panels of different sizes and shapes, to do larger panels. They were the first ones to do panels that sprawled across full pages or even double page spreads. They would have characters leaping out of the panels, tumbling out of the panels. They would have panels weighted, so the small panels would have less importance, and then they would save space for the big panels where the explosion happened. Will Eisner was very important in inventing this, or a few other people. But Simon and Kirby were the first guys who did comics that really weren't derivative of newspaper strips. Even like Joe Shuster in the early Supermans was basically channeling the Roy Crane newspaper strips like Wash Tubbs. And Bob Kane was, in the early Batmans, was drawing basically whatever swipes he had in front of him to steal from. Jack was an original guy, and he invented stuff. And all through his life, it was important to him to keep inventing new things. When I met him in 1969, he was not happy at Marvel Comics. He was drawing Fantastic Four and Thor. He had a lot of business problems with them. A new management had come in. The comic book business changed tremendously around that time. You know, we have this thing we talk about the golden age of comics, which kind of roughly went from the founding of comics to someplace in the 40s, late 40s, early 50s, when all the superhero books died out. So, okay, that was the golden age of comics. And you can delineate it by a lot of different markers, but one of them was that sales collapsed. Sales on superhero books collapsed, in particular. And then you had this dark period, which only had some really wonderful comics like the EC comics and Karl Barks in it. But then you had this thing called the Silver Age of comics that kind of started in the late 50s. And the Silver Age of comics really blossomed when Stan Lee and Jack Kirby started the Fantastic Four in 1961. By the end of the 60s, the Silver Age was ending. Now, you could denote a lot of different markers that ended the Silver Age. I tend to tell people the Silver Age officially ended when I got into the business, which was 1970. And that's not a bad marker either. But what had happened was that DC and Marvel, the two dominant companies, had both been acquired by corporations. All the original guys had sold out, grabbed their what seemed like huge paychecks at the time and now seem like chump change, and gotten out. And new people were coming in to run these companies. People who were, in some cases, were not that interested in even publishing comic books. They were interested in the merchandising rights. DC Comics was acquired largely because a company called Kinney National Services wanted to own their magazine distribution arm. And, we got a comic book company in the deal too? Well, all right, we'll have to do something with it. And newsstand distribution, which is how comic books were sold at the time, were dying out. When I got into comics, everyone was saying the comic book industry will be dead in 5 years, or the comic book industry will be dead in 8 years, because newsstands were going away. And during a lot of the 70s, I worked for a company called Western Publishing, which did Gold Key Comics. Gold Key Comics is essentially a company that went out of business because they couldn't get their product to the customer. Newsstands were dying out, and they had no other means of distribution. DC and Marvel had that problem too, but DC and Marvel had the revenue that came in from licensing their characters for TV and movie and toys and things like that. Gold Key was publishing the Disney comics, the Warner Brothers comics, Bugs Bunny and such, and they didn't share in the licensing of those characters. Well, one of the things that separated Jack from his peers was that whereas everybody who does a comic book wants to write or draw a great comic book that people will like, that will sell well. And of course Jack did. But the thing that was interesting about Jack, and I don't think there's anybody else in the field about whom this can be said, except maybe on an editorial level, is that Jack regarded every new project as, I've got to reinvent the industry, I've got to save the industry. When he went to work for DC Comics in 1970, it was with the clear idea in his head that he had to reinvent comics and come up with a new way to sell them, a new packaging, a new form, because the old form was dying out as the newsstands atrophied. And when I went to work with Jack, he started talking about new packages for comics, new ways to take them. He started telling us about graphic novels. He started telling us about mini-series. He started telling us about comics getting into bookstores and magazine racks, not on the comic book rack, but the magazine rack. And he started talking about comics in other forms. To Jack, comics were not just those little 32-page, cheaply printed things that we all know. To Jack, comics was a storytelling means. I'm going to jump ahead here for one little brief thing here. We had the first San Diego Comic Book Convention in 1970. It is hard to believe I have now been to 39 of those things. We had 500 people there, and we were ecstatic. We thought this was incredible. 500 people do comics all in the same place. And now you go to the San Diego Comic Convention, and there's 500 people ahead of you in line to buy a hot dog. And Jack was the only person who saw what that convention was going to become, because he was a visionary, and he would say to us, someday this convention is going to take over the entire city of San Diego. It's going to be huge, and it's going to be where Hollywood comes to sell the movies that they made last year and to figure out what they want to make next year. They'll be going around the dealer's room and the exhibit hall looking for ideas for next year's movies. Because the Jack comics were not just 32-page comics or even printed things. The Jack comics were a form of expression. It was a kind of storytelling, an energized kind of storytelling, and especially imaginative kind of storytelling. And if Jack were around today, he would look at the Iron Man movie, he would look at video games, he would look at all these different applications where we now see Spider-Man and the Hulk and everything, and he'd say, yeah, that's comics. That's all comics to him. And he predicted this. And at the time he told us this, we kind of went, yeah, Jack, sure, that'll happen. Because we were skeptical. Everybody was. None of us saw it coming. But he had that kind of vision that was amazing. So, and there's that word again. So in 1970, Jack came in and said, comic books are falling apart. You can't sell them on comic racks anymore. Nobody wants them. Independent News was distributing the DC product at that time. And Independent News was making something like 80% of its money off 3 magazines. They had Playboy, they had Penthouse, and they had Mad Magazine. Mad Magazine was selling 2.5 million copies per issue. Today, Mad Magazine, which is really just about as funny as it's ever been, sells less than 100,000 copies, sometimes a lot less than 100,000. My website reaches more people than Mad Magazine does in a month. Playboy magazine was selling 6 million, 8 million copies. Well, naked women haven't gotten any less popular in this world. It's the newsstand format that has gone away. And it wasn't just because the internet came along. People would say, yeah, well, of course it's not selling, Playboy's not selling what it used to. People can get stuff on the internet. Well, this was dying out before there was an internet. Magazines, somebody should write a history of this because magazines were dying out in the 70s, and Jack was addressing that. And he was the only guy in comics who was running around saying, we've got to take this into new formats. And he would go to the publishers and he would say, we've got to do these new things called graphic novels. We've got to do these new things called miniseries. And they went, yeah, you're right, Jack. We'll get to that someday. In the meantime, let's do 32-page color comics, because that was all they knew how to sell. And he did them because that was where the job was. As I told you, my father worked for the Internal Revenue and hated the job. There were aspects of his job that Jack hated. He loved being able to sit there all day and draw. But as my father felt a prisoner of his job, they were the same age. They were Depression-era Jewish kids. Jack felt a prisoner of the comic book industry. He used a little bit of that as a way an actor will use a sense memory. He did a book called Mr. Miracle, which was about an escape artist. And it was based in large part on the career of a man named Jim Steranko, who was a comic book artist that Jack liked and had helped mentor a little bit. But it was also based on Jack's own feelings of feeling trapped in the business and feeling like he had to get away and get out of the business. And in some cases, take the business with him and expand its horizons in order to free himself from that little prison that everybody in comics was in. So he did an awful lot to reinvent comics, and to this day he's still reinventing comics. One of the things that astounds me about Jack is that his work is more popular than ever. Almost everything he did is coming back into print. I have a little wonderful cottage industry going, writing the forwards for all these things. In the next year, I will write the forwards for Kirby reprint books from 5 different publishers, who between them are reprinting just about everything Jack did. DC's reprinting all the stuff he did for DC. Marvel's reprinting all the stuff he did for Marvel. There's other publishers that are picking up the other stuff. And a whole new generation is discovering him, and his work is more popular than ever. Books that he did that were considered failures at the time they came out, because they were a little ahead of the market or out of tune with the market or whatever it was, those books are now successful. And the books that at the time were successful, nobody wants. Of the many, many regrets that I have that Jack is not around to experience this, is that I would have liked to see that wonderful expression on his face. And it was not a smirking, it was not a condescending thing, it was much like, yeah, I knew it, because he knew this was going to happen all the time. He had this ability to see where the world was going and to get there ahead of everybody else. And I hope in this book I've made people realize that. A lot of people who read the book come to me and say, did he really? It's like I'm telling them about the Nostradamus of comics. And Jack was actually fascinated by Nostradamus for some reason. I wonder why. But it's a story of the comic book industry. Jack's life is a story of the industry. There was a joke when Jack died, there was a big slump in comic book sales the next year, and people said, well, when Jack died, he took the industry with him. And that was almost true in a certain way. And people would have these meetings, and they'd say, well, what does the industry need now? It needs Jack Kirby. Well, we're in trouble now. And a lot of what has happened in the last few years where comics have been built back is people who were disciples of Jack, people who grew up on his work, people who maybe he personally mentored in some way, even a brief contact, taking some of the abiding principles of his work and applying it. And of course, Marvel has done real well with movies based on characters that he created or co-created. The thing that was fascinating to me about Jack and other people was that he had this long parade of people coming to him for inspiration. And they weren't just people who wanted to draw comics. A lot of them were people who wanted to draw comic books. And Jack would encourage them not necessarily to draw comic books. There were people who would come to him with their work and he'd say, great, you're too good to get into comics. And in 1970, he told them comics are not a financially stable field. If I were starting out today, I wouldn't invest my youthful energy in them. I'd get into movies, I'd get into paintings, I'd get into I'd invent new forms for myself. He never encouraged anyone to draw like him or even to write like him. When I apprenticed with Jack, if I had somehow magically come away with the ability to replicate Kirby art, to forge Kirby art indistinguishable from his, he would have considered me a colossal failure, because Jack believed always in innovating. This is a line of his I quote frequently, and people picked up on it. One time there was a fanzine where someone was interviewed who was going to take over, I think they were the guy who was going to take over doing Captain America. And he said, yes, I'm going to do Captain America in the Kirby tradition. And I showed that to Jack, and Jack said, the kid doesn't get it. The Kirby tradition is to create a new book. The Kirby tradition is to create something new. Doing somebody else's character is not the Kirby tradition. And that's what he did the whole life. That's what he did his whole life, and that's why he left this incredible legacy of characters that he either started or revolutionized, took and made into something new on his own, or in partnership with someone like Joe Simon or Stan Lee. And I'm running out of babbling. I can answer some questions if you have any. Yes, sir.
So I think you've really done a great job of explaining how he was influential to people. How to you, what sort of ways do you see that the work you've done is better because of your time, the time you spent with him?
Well, first of all, I always emphasize that when I was Jack's assistant, I did darn near nothing. So many people have taken credit for his ideas that I feel I should balance the scale and tell you that I get none of the credit for anything he did that came out of his studio. Well, I was about as useless as you could. My big contribution was to say, hey, that looks great, Jack, or hey, I hope you bring that character back in another issue. You know, that kind of great input. What I learned from Jack, it's a long list, and a lot of these things do not relate to writing or drawing. A lot of them relate to just how to treat people, how to deal with human beings, and how to look at the world and try to see the bigger picture. Jack always would, talk to Jack about something, and he would always take it bigger. You would talk to him about any topic, and he'd say, now what does this mean in the grand scheme of the world? And he would, one of the reasons that he was not able sometimes to get his financial reward that he deserved was because he was looking at a much bigger world. When he talked to the people at Marvel about trying to get more money, he would remind them that he had, helped start the Hulk, and he had this vision that the Hulk was $1 billion property. They had this vision that the Hulk was worth a very small amount of money, and they treated Jack accordingly. When Martin Goodman, the original publisher of Marvel, sold the company, I told Jack how much he sold it for, and Jack went, that's about what Ant-Man is worth. He knew that what the Marvel properties were worth. The guy who had them didn't, so it was hard for him to get his reward for his role in creating the Marvel properties. Well, on a more prosaic, pragmatic level, one of the things I learned from Jack was an incredible work ethic. Jack would go to the drawing table around noon every day, and he would sit there until about 4 in the morning. He'd take a half hour out here to have a sandwich. He'd take an hour out to watch a TV show with his wife and have dinner, but he put in these incredible hours. The man had was so prolific. He did more pages than anybody, and he got this reputation for being fast. People talk about there are all these jokes about artists working at Marvel, and they suddenly hear a sonic boom outside, and they go, somebody drew as fast as Kirby, or something like that. Well, and he was fast, but he also was very prolific because he would sit there for 12, 13, 14 hours a day drawing. And he would draw with a pleasure to get the work finished at the end of the day, no matter what happened to it. Sometimes Jack would be finishing a page, and he would know in his heart that this was going to be ruined down the line by the inker or the printing or his collaborators or whatever. It didn't matter. He still poured 100% into everything he did. And remember, this is a Depression-era kid who at a very early age was sent out and told, you've got to earn, you got to help earn money for the family. At age 12, they sent him out to deliver newspapers because the family needed the money. And his whole life, the number one thing in his life was, I've got to have a paycheck on Friday. I've got to bring money into the family. And he was that way his entire life. He would sit down in the morning with essentially nothing. He had this ratty terrible, battered drawing table. When I went to work for Jack, I was 17 years old. I had a better drawing table at home than he had. He had a pile of paper. He had pencils. He had essentially nothing. At the end of the day, there would be 3 or 4 pages of a comic book, which A, was going to feed the family, pay the mortgage, get braces for his daughter. He had created something. He'd created money. That was a very big thing. But secondly, he had that satisfaction of a job properly done. I did something today. I earned something. I created something. And that was a reward, even if the paycheck wasn't always an adequate reward. There was a reward of satisfaction. So one of the main things I learned from Jack was that work ethic, that you've got to sit down and get your work done. You've got to keep producing it. I take it a little different direction in my own life. I figure if you do enough stuff, maybe some of it will be good. But that comes from Jack, that idea that if you're going to do a job, do it, and do it for real, and commit yourself to it. And I think a lot of that you see it in his artwork, because he commits to everything. If he's going to draw a fight scene, he draws a fight scene. If he's going to draw a galaxy, he draws a galaxy. He decides what he's going to do, and he does it. And that was one of the things that impressed me about Jack. Another thing that impressed me about Jack a lot in a work area was this idea that you've got to keep looking at something and think, how do we make this new? That's at least got to be your goal. Obviously, you can't always succeed in it, but he would take that road. People ask me a lot of times, what was Jack's favorite thing to do? Did he like drawing superheroes? Did he like drawing westerns? Did he like drawing war stories? The honest answer is he liked anything. And he took them as personal challenges. Frequently, he was not doing the work that he would have chosen to do. Frequently, he was assigned. They'd come to him and say, we want you to do this comic, we want you to do this book. And under duress, he would take something on. But it wouldn't be that much protest, because at some point he would think, okay, they want me to do this. How do I make this work? How do I make this work for me? So if you'd gone to Jack and said, Jack, we want a comic book about gay penguins, he might have argued with you that that was not a commercial thing to do. He might have said, no, the marketplace doesn't want gay penguins right now, whatever. But if you were serious about that, or if he felt to be a team player for the company, he had to go along with it, he would sit down and say, okay, how do I make a gay penguin comic interesting, not only to the readers, but to myself? What's the personal way what's the twist I can put on it? It's like, sometimes artists will be told, or they'll say as a personal challenge, all right, I'm going to do this painting without using any green. It's a discipline, and it forces you to channel your creativity into other ways, and you handicap yourself in one way, hoping that it will manifest itself in something great on the other end. And he would do that a lot. So, if they said to him, we want crime comics, he'd go, great, I'm gonna do the best crime comics I can. If they said to him, we want westerns, he'd say, fine, I'm gonna do exciting westerns. And he was really happy doing anything. Yes, sir.
So when I was, I think, 11 or 12, I came across at someone's house a copy of one of the maybe New Gods #1 or something like that. And later on discovered it seemed like that he had created this whole amazing universe out of more or less whole cloth. Was it totally his creation?
New Gods was totally his creation, yeah. Everything in it.
So he just left Marvel then?
He had left Marvel. The last couple of years Jack was at Marvel, he had a lot of problems. As Marvel went through this transition, he had not liked the way the old owners treated him. They didn't treat him that well. Some of you may be familiar with a storyline that they did in the Fantastic Four about a guy named Galactus. Galactus was this giant, godlike creature that would come in and feast on planets. He would find a planet, he would essentially eat it. He would leave this cold, barren, lifeless shell. And that was based on, everything that Jack did was based on something that had an emotional interest in his life. He found, they teach you, I learned a little bit about Jack actually when I had a girlfriend who was an actress, and I went to some acting classes with her, and I learned a lot more about acting. Because in acting, a lot of times they teach you to take personal things from your life and put it into the work. If you're doing a scene where you have to react to, you come upon 10 dead bodies, 10 people have been killed, you find some moment of pain in your own life, you know, when your dog died, and you use that emotion to inform your performance. Well, Jack would take everything and find some way to make it personal. And sometimes the references were so obscure you and I would never see them. A couple of times they're a little more obvious. In the case of when he did this Galactus thing, where Galactus was coming in and was going to feast on the earth and eat it and leave us all, Jack had been reading in the newspapers about corporate takeovers. There were a lot of them in the 60s because the tax laws had changed and it became very advantageous. And he was sitting there thinking, what happens when, and with Jack it was a when, not an if, some corporation comes in and buys Marvel and takes it over, because a lot of these corporations would come in and do exactly what Galactus had done. They would leave they would strip the thing of its assets and leave it a shell. A pattern which is continuing to this day if you've been watching the financial news. So a lot of what Jack was drawing and contributing to the story of that Galactus thing was his fear of what would happen when Marvel was taken over. Well, when it was taken over, some of that came to pass. And some of it seemed very possible and probable for a while. So Jack was worried in 1968 or 69 that he would have to go someplace else, that he wouldn't have that weekly paycheck from Marvel that kept him a little bit of a prisoner there because he needed that weekly paycheck. So he created a whole bunch of new characters. He sat down and he invented a bunch of characters with different ideas of what they might be. And he had a pile of them. And whenever he met someone who might be in a position to fund a new comic book company or to hire him in some other capacity, some other way related, he would show them these brand new characters and say, look, I've got all these new ideas for new books. And when DC finally, when the situation at Marvel became so intolerable that he had to leave, he went to DC, they wanted all those new characters, so Jack took them and he invented the New Gods. He had this idea about the young gods while he was at Marvel. In the back of the Thor comic, he was doing a strip called Tales of Asgard that told different stories of the Norse gods as warped for Marvel continuity as they were. And the way those stories were done is that Jack had this little paperback book of Norse legends he'd found someplace. He found it in a secondhand bookshop in the 50s. He had a wonderful library of old books that were falling apart. And it came time to do Tales of Asgard, he would just take the book and open it up to the next legend, and that would be that Tales of Asgard for that month. And he skipped a couple of stories because the book was missing pages, they'd fallen out. When he got to the end of that, near the end of that book, he thought, what are we going to do next? He thought, new generation of gods. And the last couple Tales of Asgard stories, you can see him kind of setting it up. He's talking about the day the old gods die and the new gods take over. And at that point he thought, wait a minute, this is too good an idea to give Marvel now, the way they're treating me. And he had put a moratorium around late 67, early 68. He kind of put a moratorium on new characters at Marvel. He stopped suggesting new ideas for Silver Surfers and Black Panthers and whatever it was. He just felt he was giving them too many ideas for this low page rate, and that they were not making good on what he perceived as certain financial guarantees to him. So he kind of went partially on strike. He kept doing the best Fantastic Four stories he could, but he wasn't inserting new villains or new characters the way he once had or suggesting them. So he sat on this young gods idea for a while. And when DC wanted him, of course, for obvious reasons, they said, what do you want to do? And one of the first ideas he came up with was, let's do young gods. And he took a lot of these ideas that he had, the drawing that became Light Ray, the drawing that became Orion, the drawing that became Metron, and he formed them into this thing called which somebody else named the Fourth World. And I still, to this day, do not understand why the Fourth World. I'm not sure there's a reason. It may just be a name that has no relation to anything. And it burst forward. Now, he had intended that as a comic book that he would launch and he would pass on to others after a few issues because he didn't want to get stuck doing 32-page comics. When he went to DC in 1970, his idea was, I've got to revolutionize the industry, I've got to start new forms, but they want some conventional color comics, so I'll start this, and I'll supervise it, and I'll get this kid named Mark Evanier I've just met to write him, and I'll get artists I know to draw them. And DC said, no, we want you to write and draw them. So he turned them into a very personal work. He had not intended the Fourth World was going to be this magnum opus that he would do as an epic over many, many years, but once he got into it, it became that. Again, it's Jack taking something he's doing a little bit under duress or against his better judgment, saying, how do I make this work for myself? And he did this Fourth World series, which one of the great tragedies, I think, of the comic book business is that he wasn't allowed to finish it at the time. It was canceled for reasons that are a little arguable as far as sales go. It was not putting Marvel out of business, but I don't think the sales were as bad as they were made out to be at the time. It could have kept going. At that time, a low-selling comic was one that made a modest profit. A big-selling comic was one that made a little less modest a profit. The business did not have a huge gap of what lost money and what made money, because everything was selling 100,000 copies to 200,000 copies. And there wasn't that much difference in between. They could have kept it going a while. They tried to try something different, hoping he'd luck on to the next new trend. Because Jack was a guy you could bet on, maybe. It was a smart wager sometimes to bet on this guy. So did I answer your question? I more than answered your question, I'm sorry. Anybody else want to? Yes, sir.
I didn't start collecting comics until probably 1990, 91. At the time, there was a new company starting out called Image.
Image, yes.
And a lot of these guys came from Marvel, and they cited the reason for starting their own company by pointing to Kirby and Lee and saying that they hadn't gotten their own dues.
Yeah.
I was always curious what Kirby thought of that, and especially in light of like, the lawsuits afterwards that happened.
Well, the Jack loved the Image guys. These are the guys, for those you don't know, a lot of the top writers and artists of DC and Marvel in the early 90s decided to break away, and they had these reputations that could carry the readership with them, and they started a thing called Image Comics. And Todd McFarlane did this new comic called Spawn, and Eric Larson did this new comic called Savage Dragon, and so on. And they were very successful books. They made a lot of money, and the most important thing, I think, for most of these guys was control. One of the things that was maddening about comics was that you could create something brand new. You could pour your guts into it. You could put your life into it. As you know, anyone here who writes something very personal knows it's not just a commodity. It's something that you believe in. That's part of your life, and then you have to let someone take it away from you. You have to if you were doing a comic book in the 60s or 70s for DC or Marvel, you could pour your heart into a comic, and then the next month they could say, oh, we're going to have somebody else do it, and you do this other book. You become interchangeable. I know a lot of writers will tell you stories about how painful it was on a personal level. They were doing a comic and they were going along, and they would like base parts of it on their own lives. And they would make this character based on that woman they loved, and they'd make this character based on their mother, and they would use parts of that. And then all of a sudden they wake up one morning and somebody else is doing their comic, and they're making this character a prostitute, and this character is getting killed, and this character is having a psychodrama, whatever. And it just hurts you. Guys who were drawing comics in the 60s, we had this notion where one guy would pencil the story out, and then they'd give it to the editor, and the editor would give it to somebody else to ink. So you were asked as an artist to stay up late and redraw stuff and get it all penciled out and draw it to your heart with every ounce of talent you had, and then turn loose of it. Just emotionally give up on it and give it to the editor and not care what he did with it. Not care if he gave it to a bad inker or had parts of it redrawn or had it badly printed or had it badly colored. Creative people can't work like that. I mean, some have to at times. And guys who came out of that Depression era generation were more inclined to go along with that because of their background. But a new generation of comic people didn't want to do that. And Jack didn't really want to do that very much. They wanted to control the work. I do a comic book called Gru the Wanderer with a man named Sergio Aragones. We own it. We control it. We did it for a company called Pacific Comics. Pacific Comics went out of business. All its assets were sold in a bankruptcy sale. They didn't sell Gru. We owned it. If Pacific had owned it, it would have gotten sold, and God knows who would have wound up owning it, controlling it, writing it, drawing it. We kept it. We took it to other publishers. We control it. People come to us all the time with very, very bad ideas about what to do with Gru for merchandising, or they want to, I'm sure if other writers came in, they would change Gru in ways that we don't want it changed. It's enormously satisfying and fulfilling for us that good, bad, or indifferent, we, the creative people, and I'm using the word creative very loosely, obviously, control Gru. So Jack loved the idea that these Image guys were now in control of their work, financially and creatively. And he envied them, but it wasn't a spiteful envy. Jack was very non-competitive. The fact that you did better than he didn't bother him. He was concerned that he didn't do well, But if you did well, fine. He didn't think in terms of, he didn't keep lists of who's doing better than him or anything like that. He was very, very, that's another thing I think I learned from the guy, not to keep comparing yourself to other people or you know, coming up with competitions that don't matter in life. What matters in life is that you do work you're happy with, that you're rewarded and such. So he loved the Image guys, and he helped them out a little bit here and there, and they helped him. They did a couple of projects that were basically designed to funnel some money to the Kirbys at a time when they needed it. So, yes, sir.
Are there any current writers or artists that you think embody some of what Jack Kirby was about?
There's lots of people who do things that today that I think carry on that thing that I was talking about, the Kirby tradition of creating something new. I don't have any particular fondness for people who I look at their pages and I go, oh, he's drawing hands like Jack, or he's doing Jack's compositions. Not that there's anything wrong with learning from Jack, but I remember I did a Mr. Miracle special for DC one time with an artist named Steve Rude, who's one of my best friends. And we took it out to Jack and gave him copies of it, and Jack was genuinely thrilled with what Steve had done, because Steve had gotten Kirby-style energy on the page without doing Kirby tricks. He'd gotten to the right place by his own route. And that impressed Jack a lot, and that impresses me. Yeah, there's a lot of artists out there who are doing something brand new and different, and it's exciting, and it's interesting, and it's their own style. And if I start naming them, I will leave out certain key people who are friends of mine who will watch this on YouTube and then write me very angry emails. So yeah, there's a lot of guys out there. And most of them, I'm not going to say all of them, but most of them acknowledge that Jack was an inspiration. I went to the premiere of Sin City, Frank Miller's movie, and there's nothing in there that looks like it was drawn by Jack, but there are staging moments and scenes where there's, oh my God, it's Kirby energy on the screen. And you see where Frank has done something which Jack believed very strongly in, which is that you could take a comic book, a well-drawn comic book, and use it as the storyboard for a movie. And there's moments in there where Frank took stuff literally out of the panels he had done and they brought it to life on the screen. And at the end, in the list of acknowledgments, there's Jack's name. And I think that would have pleased Jack tremendously to see that acknowledged, because it was a confirmation that he was right about what comics could be. And this is another example of taking comics into another medium. Anybody else? I guess I get to wrap up now. Thank you very much, and I hope you people will visit my website as often as I visit yours. Thank you.